really excited to have you here and excited for a good conversation. I'm going to get started by asking a question to our two panelists. Maybe Nilo can go first in answering it. The structure of this webinar, by the way, is that I have a few questions for panelists and we're going to take a brief break in the middle, and we're hoping to wrap this all up by around 9:30 p.m. EDT. Great. So our first question, starting off with the basics, why do some trade unionists say that cops are not workers, and how do police harm the labor movement?
Hi, everyone. Thank you to organizers, and thanks to everybody who are listening today. Well, why cops are not workers? I like to start with what James Baldwin says: cops are cops, and there's no more confusion about it. And as it has been stated over and over, cops are the arm's length of the state. And so then some people might ask or say that, what about 1% versus 99%, which was strategic and very important for example, Occupy movement. But we know that although it might have been important for that cause, but if we look at the notion that they use, which is well, somebody exchange labor in the market for money and that makes them worker. If we look at it in the case of the cops, it's kind of like depoliticize and dehistoricize what we are looking at. What we should look at is like the structural violence of the society and where cops stands there, and historicize it within the labor movement and other movements within the society. And by saying that, let's look at, for example, there's lots of stuff documented and written about 1919 Winnipeg general strike and how violent was the response of the cops to that, and ongoing kind of criminalization of many of the labor organizers beside other organizers in our society. For example, when postal workers got back to work legislation by federal government like 2-3 years ago, there were many of the union organizers who, in support of them, started this pop-up kind of strikes here and there, and most of them were ending by interference of the police. So we see that police is not on the side of the workers, and also to put it in another kind of context, we see that in the past few decades, what the Canadian government, both federal or provincial, have been following was austerity measures. And when we see austerity measures, we see different aspects of it as constant privatization or outsourcing of unionized jobs. And then many of the full-time unionized workers become part-time non-unionized workers. And disproportionately, it's affect women and people of color. As we know, they are the last hired, first fired part of our labor force. And then we see a huge cut in our social services that affects all the working class, especially working class standard of life. Simultaneously, we see the raise in police funding year after year, which also affects the communities that are being affected by these cuts and austerity measures, which is mostly racialized, Indigenous, and Black communities that also face disproportionately criminalization and face police violence in their communities. So putting all these in one context, my answer is that cops are not workers. But if union leaders are really want to stretch, not stretch, like go beyond the classic definition of workers, there are many sectors of workers in our society that need unionization for the basic security and safety in our society, such as sex workers, have such struggle to be recognized as workers, kind of like in Canada. Or, for example, incarcerated workers who are in prison because cops have arrested them and have faced lots of violence in that process. Or workers that have no status, and they are not being recognized as workers. What they have been referred is illegals. People in our society which we believe in no one is illegal. And well, the list goes on and on. Like, for example, migrant workers, especially migrant farm workers who have been historically banned from even becoming unionized. So why we do not shift our focus in those sectors of society that have been pushed into the margins forcefully, not just by the states, but with the help of the policing and surveillance in our kind of like society. And also, I believe that police just doesn't just work as armed length of the state. They also sometimes act like a private security of big businesses such as oil companies. For example, our unions have supported Unistoten. And what we have seen there was like direct attack on land defenders by heavily kind of like armed police going there. And you sometimes wonder, are they just private security of the Enbridge or something? Or like other oil and gas companies? And why we don't look at the work of indigenous land defenders and environmental activists as form of environmental work that is about sustaining the earth. Like, why sustaining the earth? We do not kind of like think as it as form of work. Why we exclude so many different form of works that are very important to our well-being, and then focusing on like the notion that cops are workers, like that doesn't make sense. Like we have this vision of how to build a labor movement and become bigger and stronger by including the kind of like forces that moves us through the vision of more equality, equity, and fairness in our society by keeping ourselves safe. Also, the ask for defund the police is in line with that like then refunnel all those funds into something useful, that all those kind of like services that we all need desperately, especially like, for example, paid sick days, our health system, like social housing, and on are the examples of how defund the police can help us to build this vision that we have to kind of like change and confront this structural violences that we see in the society, and the police forces are part of that, part of the problem.
Yeah, that was a great, extremely thorough answer. Thank you, Nilu. Yeah, I think we are seeing how a lot of those priorities play out as, you know, the governments are releasing their budgets, and we're seeing, you know, despite all of the action of the last year, you know, governments are still putting into place increases in police budgets, and it sort of beggars the imagination how that could be possible. But when you put it like that, it does make sense why we're continuing to see those increases. Ryan, do you have anything to add? Actually, before I do that, I'm just going to remind panelists again to speak slowly. I know that Noelle is having a little bit of a hard time keeping up with the interpretation. So a reminder to speak slowly and take some pauses. Ryan, anything to add?
Hard to add to that. It was quite a comprehensive and excellent answer. But maybe I would just sum up by saying, I agree with Nilu, and I would just say there is no place for police in the labor movement. They are antagonists to the movement, not protagonists within it. And just as Nilu said, by welcoming them within the movement, it actually flattens and depoliticizes what the labor movement can actually do, because just as Nilu said, when we're talking about Unistoten, when we're talking about community struggles for racial justice, these are the exact forces that are pushing against and often directly repressing those struggles. And so to have them in our House of Labor is actually to mean that we are not in alliance with those struggles, which I think would be a huge setback for our movements and contrary to our goals. So I would just offer that, and also just coming into this conversation, want to thank the organizers, everyone here today. And I know many people are community and labor activists. So if you have questions, if there's ways that you've been trying to have these conversations with fellow union members and you want to help troubleshoot that, please post that in the chat. Because I think part of our hope for this conversation today is that it would assist with these organizing conversations.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Maybe that leads us to our second question, which is, where do police exist in the labor movement? So which unions, for example, have cops, border guards, Aboriginal police forces, prison guards in them? And also, what's the difference between a police union or a police association and police bargaining units?
Sure. It might be helpful to start with the second part of your question, Saima. So just to distinguish that there are sort of police-only unions. So that would be things like, I'm based in Toronto, so the Toronto Police Association, or if you're in Winnipeg, the Winnipeg Police Association, or Vancouver Police Union. There's also provincial bodies like the OPP Association, or now with the RCMP, the National Police Federation. These are police-only unions, but there are also police bargaining units in labor movement unions. And to your question of, which ones, I would invite our panelists, our attendees, drop the name of your union in the list. We could probably, in the chat, we can probably find a connection, but just having done sort of some of my own research, there's at least a dozen unions, national and major provincial unions, that have police, border guards, and correctional officers within their unions. And again, it's hard to have kind of a comprehensive number because these things aren't actually tracked. So it's sort of, you have to go piece by piece and search through collective agreements. But again, just doing a cursory search, there's at least 35,000 of these kind of carceral workers within labor movement unions that are affiliated with the Canadian Labour Congress or with their equivalents in Quebec, that are within our union. So that's what we're talking about when we say like police out of our unions. And sometimes there's confusion, like in some of the earlier reporting on this, unions would say like, no, actually we have no police in our unions. But again, we're talking about police and policing as a system of organized violence. So we're not just looking at officers with weapons, but we're looking at the entire apparatus of surveillance and repression as something that is a much broader phenomenon and extends to the border, extends to prisons. And as you said, Saima, and as Nilu pointed out, it's something that's rapidly growing. And so there's a campaign by the Abolition Coalition, and they call it the Campaign for Real Safety. And they pointed out that in the recent federal budget, there's almost $3 billion in new money for prisons, and also another almost $3 billion for police. So these are kind of rapidly growing areas.
Yeah, and maybe the follow-up question to that then, I can also see that Noah wants a pause between speakers, so I'll do that for a second. So this is one question that we've already gotten in the Q&A, but I think when you start to talk about defunding the police, one of the responses that you get from within labor unions is that that's an anti-labor stance, or an anti-union stance. How would you respond to that claim?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think cops are making our unions stronger. They are making us weaker. As while we see, like in the past decades, the unions have shrinked, and the labor have kind of stayed behind the policy changes and in austerity measures and stuff, instead of focusing to enter the sectors of the kind of such as cops into the union to grow it and say, oh no, we are actually getting bigger. The unions and labor really needs to put effort in organizing and unionizing the sectors of the working class that it has been marginalized. Like there was a great effort of unionizing Foodora workers, and we saw that the Foodora company then pulled out, but then the workers won the case in the court to get the money that they can then put into rebuilding their own maybe co-op or whatever they need to do to empower themselves. So my point is that kicking out and defunding the forces that are not keeping our many sectors of our labor force safe and actually imposing kind of threats, surveillance, and violence towards them is not weakening. It's actually empowering us to funnel that money into the kind of way more needed social kind of services, and that will kind of build more secure jobs in the society. Will more people get employed in the newer and also other forms of work that are useful to all of us. Growing our unions towards that direction that will kind of confront this structural kind of violence, which is completely in racism, sexism, and many other intersectional forms of violence that we see in the society.
Thank you, Nilu. Anything to add, Ryan?
Just my agreement again that, I think it's actually a pro-union position. It's about building a multiracial, pro-equity labor movement, and that means taking a position on issues of racial justice. And then just picking up, some people message to us as panelists, the unions that they're affiliated with. So just to fill in some of those connections, some people mentioned the BCGEU, and so they would be the ones who represent the provincial correctional officers. Another person mentioned campus police. And so I also want to draw attention, I'll drop in in the chat, there's a campaign focused on getting cops off campus in American and Canadian campuses. And that's quite a range of unions. There isn't one particular union. It's a bit of piecemeal. And then someone else mentioned cops out of CUPE, which I'm sure we'll be talking about more with Nilu on the panel and some of our guests here as attendees. Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. So we know that a lot of police unions are already in their own federations. So For example, Briarpatch published a piece relatively recently by James Wilt that looked very closely at the Winnipeg Police Association and all of the work that they've been doing to obstruct accountability for police officers who kill or hurt people, and the sort of political power that they wield as well in continually winning increases to the budget of the Winnipeg Police Service. So another thing that we often hear when we talk about Labor's role in defunding police is that if cops are expelled from unions, as groups like Cops Out of CUPE or SEIU Drop the Cops are calling for, then cops would just join independent associations, and they would possibly even be stronger or have more, arguably more bargaining power in independent associations. What's your response to that kind of concern?
I could maybe start, and I'm sure Nilu can add. I think it's helpful to look at some of the realities, like what is actually existing police and prison unionism look like in Canada. And the piece that you referred to, Saima, is really a great one that James Wilt did, looking at the Winnipeg Police Association, and other people have analyzed, for example, the Toronto Police Association, and sort of the role that they've played. James Wilt and another co-author also did a really good piece on the correctional officers in Manitoba. And I would just use that as a starting point, where I'm more familiar with the case here in Ontario where I'm based. But what we actually see, for example, with OPSEU, the Public Service Employees Union that represents correctional officers, is that they actually end up having this disproportionately powerful role within unions, because they're often very well organized and sometimes regarded as being more militant. And so recently, there was an attempted raid of the OPSEU correctional officers by another union, a Quebec-based union. And that actually resulted in OPSEU doubling down on their prison unionism. So you had the actual leadership of OPSEU calling for more prisons to be built, and championing their record around increasing basically the carceral system. And so one day you'd have them put out a statement saying we need to end the legacy of slavery, and then the next day they would literally be putting out a statement talking about why we need more correction staff and more prisons. So it's quite a contradictory position to be in. And of course it puts racialized workers within that union in a really difficult position. It puts a lot of people in a difficult position, and kind of hampers anti-racism work within unions. And again, just to speak to that example, to flesh it out a bit more, it was actually the correctional officers who were resisting the call to depopulate prisons during COVID when there were massive outbreaks. And this was a direct risk to people's health, and ultimately to those correctional officers' health as well, because they were caught up in the spread. And you might remember as well, last year, this was in the federal scene. And so these are workers who are represented by a Quebec-based union that represents all the federal correctional officers in federal prisons. And this was actually the union that was trying to raid OPSEU. But they were the ones who leaked to media the plans to offer vaccines to prisoners because they were considered a high-risk population. And this resulted in the leader of the Conservative Party, Aaron O'Toole, saying no criminals should be getting vaccines before anyone else. And it was quite a scene. And this was prompted by the activism of correctional officers who are part of, on paper, part of our labor movement. And so this speaks to the actual role that they play, and how it's counterproductive to our goals.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying about the contradiction inherent there in having members of unions who are police or prison guards is something that was deeply felt in that piece. Like, the prison guards were instrumental in expanding Manitoba's carceral capacity and basically using the argument that prisons were overcrowded, and that, you know, as that being one part of poor working conditions for them. And so as workers, obviously, unions are intended to fight for better working conditions for their members. But in this case, in the case of MGEU, those members actually, you know, fighting for better working conditions for prison guards meant building more prisons, expanding carceral capacity in Manitoba, which is something that the labor movement should absolutely be standing against, because Manitoba has such high rates of Indigenous incarceration, and we know that prisons are an extension of or one tool of colonialism. Nila, do you have anything to add to that?
Just a very short comment that's like, if union structure would work as a form of like accountability process, would that argument might have a little bit of go for me, that like if like the members of the police wrongdoing would face consequence through the labor and through the union. But that is not the reality. We see that especially maybe it's more in news what happening in US, and most of the union reps for cops stand behind murders, stand behind all the violence that the members of their forces doing. And that is not what makes us stronger. We want a labor movement. We want unions that support their workers and also provide an accountability process for the members too. With I'm talking about from the abolitionist, prison abolitionist.
Les abolitionnistes des prisons. Et nous parlons aussi d'expulser les policiers de nos syndicats, de parler de la vision et comment ça va de pair avec le définancement de la police et de créer ensuite quelque chose. Ce n'est pas juste négatif d'expulser, mais c'est aussi de la mettre, de rebâtir notre mouvement dans une meilleure direction. Merci, Nilou. Je vais prendre une toute petite pause afin de laisser Noël respirer. Alors, nous voyons aussi les questions.
And I have a question here about how will removing police from unions actually decrease their power? And are there other ideas around how to decrease police power? One idea that has been floated recently is actually limiting the rights of police to collectively bargain. I'm curious, Ryan and Niloo, if you have any takes on that idea.
Sure. Maybe to add, there's one point I didn't touch on, which I think also helps frame an answer to that question, which is that in the case of the raid that I talked about with OPSU, the union is actually spending millions of dollars to keep these members and to persuade them that they are the most prison positive union. And we've also seen this, you know, in the case that Nila was talking about, where there's many workers who need to have a union. They deserve to be supported in their organizing. And instead, what you've seen, for example, in the CUPE example, is they spent 2 years spending organizing resources on organizing members of the RCMP instead of precarious or lower wage workers. And so it's a part of the resource question. We've talked about how obviously the labor movement, our resources are limited. So how are we prioritizing them? I think we definitely agree that spending them on organizing the police is counterproductive in both the long, but also short term. And then to your question about, like the actual mechanics of it, I think one, by removing police from our labor movement unions, it takes one, it allows us to have more space for anti-racist activists, for Black folks, Indigenous folks, and racialized people to actually feel comfortable and safe articulating their lived realities. And I don't think you can't discount that. It allows, so it empowers workers. That's one thing that it does. And then I would argue it disempowers those agents of state-sanctioned violence by not giving them a platform. Yes, they will likely join these police-only unions, but this is where the campaign to defund the police comes in, and we have to wholly commit ourselves to that as well. When it comes to proposals around limiting bargaining rights, we've seen some ideas out of the US, and these mostly come from like lawyers and people who take a more technical approach. I think the risk there is that one, we've seen that our governments, like Nilu mentioned, are only too happy to limit labor rights and find new ways of creating anti-labor legislation that could very easily extend beyond the police. So that obviously does give me some pause. The other piece is that when we talk about defunding as an abolitionist vision, where we're looking for alternatives to policing and real ways to find real safety for our communities, we also want to avoid the type of reforms that legitimize the police and actually often involve more resources going to the police for training or body cams, or in the case of, I forget which city was it Waterloo, where they rebranded their police cruisers to be more diverse. So that's not what we want. And so I think the defunding piece is really crucial. I think it's critical for us to take a principled position because it will empower workers and it will deplatform the police.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. So the first half of this webinar has been a little bit of the 101 stuff, the basic, why defund the police and what will it actually do to get cops out of our unions. Before we get to the second half of the webinar, in which we're going to be talking a little bit about the how of how do we defund the police and how do we get them out of our unions, and talking to about examples of people who are organizing to that effect. We're going to read a few anecdotes. So to give a little context for these anecdotes, and I'm also going to ask my team members to set up the screen share that we have while I'm speaking. So the context for these anecdotes is that when we were planning this webinar has been in the works for months. We have been reaching out to a lot of people and talking to a lot of people about speaking on this webinar, especially union staffers. And what we heard time and time again from a number of people is that they weren't comfortable speaking publicly about this out of fear of their job and out of fear of reprisals. And that's one of the reasons we put on this webinar, is to get some people who are willing to speak publicly about something that there's a lot of silence and secrecy and hesitancy about within the labor movement. And so one thing that we did was that we set up a document where people, primarily union staffers, but also union members in general, could write down anecdotes about their experiences with broaching the topics of defunding the police in Canadian labor unions and the role of police, including prison guards and border guards in Canadian labor unions, with the intent of reading these anecdotes out anonymously during this webinar to give the participants in this webinar a sense of what exactly are we up against? What is happening inside unions? What kind of rhetoric is being used? And what are the challenges that people who are trying to raise these issues are encountering? So I think we can start the screen share. Great, thank you so much. So the first anecdote, someone writes, I work for a national union that has police and other agents of the carceral state among its membership. Through my position, I have been able to firsthand watch as these bargaining units wield power disproportionate to their numbers and in the union. I've watched entire discussions on defund the police and just recovery be tabled because of one or two dissenting voices, rather than any push to engage those dissenting voices on the issue. If the carceral agents dissent, the conversation just disappears. I have seen the union say publicly and loudly that they are a leader in anti-racism work, and then secretly brand themselves as a law enforcement union. I have seen the incredibly huge amounts of money spent on these police units, causing other bargaining units to go without. I have seen the casual sexism and racism that seems to be an accepted part of their union culture, and watched as it goes unchallenged by leadership. Internally, there are other staff that earnestly want to have the conversation about police in our unions, but many are afraid to speak up for fear of reprisals. Many don't know where to begin in challenging the culture of viewing members for their value as dues income, rather than critically reflecting on the negative role police members play in the work that the union does, especially around migrant justice, anti-racism work, and the movement towards a just recovery. So this person linked a CTV News article about the president of the union representing custom workers who went on TV and said that there had been around 8,000 people at the border of Lacolle in the last 48 hours. I believe that it implied or said, oh, sorry, the interview was advertised with a banner that read 8,000 Jews in 48 hours at the border, sort of whipping up these anti-Semitic fears. So this anecdote, the person wrote, these are the types of comments and reactions that we have to consistently work around and push back against. I remember working on a union panel discussion about Islamophobia and the negative impacts and profiling that many Muslim folks are subjected to. I received calls from border guards asking, why is the union having this panel and why are we portraying border guard members as racist, and that they can't believe their dues are being used to put this on. So also just a reminder that this unit of customs workers is represented under PSAC, and that unit is also currently being rated by CSN UCCO. Yeah. So the third anecdote, there was a case with an Indigenous police force where the issue was the termination of a police officer for police brutality. This police officer had brought a member from the community into the police station, and while the member was tied up, used force to physically assault the member. This was an Indigenous community. Although the police force had fired him, the union filed a grievance for the termination, and so the file has to be reviewed. In this case, the person survived, but I'm sure will continue to have long-lasting negative effects from the incident. There are no clear policies when we should just say, no way are we representing this police officer. So we actually have to give sincere consideration to this police officer's rights after his own police force has determined he should be fired for his brutality. Furthermore, the police member recognized he had Métis lineage, but no real lived experience, and made comments such as, the Indigenous community also discriminates against non-Indigenous people. How does this work, defending such officers, fit within our broader anti-racist statements and goals? The fourth anecdote reads, I work at a nonprofit community organization and we are looking to unionize. A lot of our work revolves around mitigating the harms of state-sanctioned violence on community members. We work with people who've been racially profiled by the police or who have precarious status in this country. Unionizing would provide much needed stability for our organization's workers who are mostly on short-term contracts. But being in a union that advocates for the expansion of policing goes against our work and our values. It has been a disheartening process to find that labor unions are expanding the systems that destroy our communities, all under the guise of, quote, all workers have the right to organize, unquote. I was really looking forward to unionizing, but as majority racialized frontline workers, we don't feel comfortable joining a union that protects agents of the state. This is, I believe, the last anecdote. Yeah. My union held a webinar which sought to help white union members learn about anti-racism and their role in that movement. A number of members protested the webinar, sending emails saying that it was a racist to specifically name and target white people as the audience of a webinar on anti-racism. Some members, most of whom were from the border guard bargaining unit of the union, posted numerous sexist, racist, violent, and sometimes genocidal comments about the webinar on Facebook. The executive of the border guard bargaining unit officially directed their members not to attend the webinar, using the excuse that one of the panelists slated to speak at the webinar had sworn at a right-wing troll on Twitter. This element of the union continues to use its power to block ongoing conversations and education on the topic of anti-racism. So those are some of the anecdotes that we collected anonymously from people who were not able to speak publicly at this webinar today, but they give us a sense of what's going on behind the scenes in some of these unions and the challenges that people are up against when they try to raise issues of anti-racism or defunding or removing the police from within unions. So that leads us to the second part of this webinar, which is, what do we do about this? So to start off this part of the conversation, I'm going to ask Nilu and Ryan, how is labor complicit in policing, and why are labor leaders so resistant to talking about defunding the police?
Well, labor is complicit for including police in our unions. And then, as you see in these anecdotes, it gives such a platform for to the officers of all kinds to express their extreme racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of violence publicly, and they feel supported and secure to do so. And it is not like isolated cases. We see that whenever even an anti-racist resolution wants to go to CUPE National or provincial CUPE conventions, there's lots of resistance. And there's lots of politics, lobbying, and issues to get even these resolutions on the ground. And it shows that there is a serious issues within union leadership. Not obviously, I'm not talking about every person in the leadership position, but the structural issues and that kind of like let such things happen. I pass it on to Ryan.
Yeah, I think On the complicity question, I think we've already touched on like the police in our unions. We've touched on police in their own unions and these broader dynamics. And I think it would be important to also mention that as workers, we are also often upholding and reproducing carceral systems. And so there are education workers right now who are organizing to get police out of schools. And I think that's great. And there's social workers who are trying to find alternatives to calling police on clients or drug users. And Nilu also spoke to the realities of sex workers and other workers who are criminalized over the course of doing their work. So that's some other ways that I think we can look at the connections between the labor movement and systems of policing and incarceration. One more would be around pension plans. For those of us who are fortunate enough to have them, they're often invested in for-profit prisons, and these are things that should be called into question. And activists will tell us that oftentimes the managers of these funds will push back and say, their responsibilities are only around, this fiduciary responsibility to get the most returns on these investments. But I think it's really important for us as union activists to say there needs to be an ethical screen. And I think there's some more appetite for that. But the closer it gets to the actual heart of unions, and I think, maybe Nilu could speak to this or another member of your local, like when you actually put these issues on the floor, I think in some ways it's about the particular issues of police and sometimes the challenge around having that conversation, the way it's been politicized. But it's also at its heart this kind of question of union democracy. There's some people in unions, in leadership, who don't want to be told that they should have to go to their membership to get a mandate for who they should be organizing. And so I think there's also this broader question of sometimes there's pushback because there's pushback to rank and file activism in general.
Anything to add, Nilu? So the next question is, what have you and the groups you organize with been working on? This was a question that was geared a little bit more to Julia speaking about her work with SEIU Drop the Cops, which is Julia is doing that work primarily in California as part of her local, but I know that that Nilu is part of a local that supported the Cops Out of CUPE resolution. Nilu, maybe you can talk a little bit about what that resolution was and what it looked like to support it.
Yes, although when the resolution went on, I was rank and file member, so supported the resolution, but there were other members of my union that were more active to take it to the convention and put it actually supporting it on the ground, which is ongoing. But I see that many people also ask that, how would that even look like? How we can kick the cops out of the union? Well, there are two ways. One is taking the resolutions and pass it within the conventions.
Passer les résolutions dans les conventions, par exemple, laisser tomber les flics. La résolution originale dans le chartre de l'affaire sur la plancher, la GRC, opération, etc., de rejeter toutes les agents casserelles dans le mouvement syndical canadien et de arrêter l'allocation des fonds vers les forces de l'État d'encourager les locales à sponsoriser les résolutions encourageant les efforts à OFL et CLC pour les mêmes de donner une lettre en expliquant cette position en tant qu'une valeur importante à CUPE Ontario. Alors, mettre ces résolutions font face à beaucoup d'opposition sur le terrain. Ils essaient d'arrêter de venir au terrain. Et comme Ryan l'a dit, l'organisation de base autour de ces changements, si de plus en plus membres syndicaux viennent et parlent de la violence brutalière, violence policière, ça va forcer les dirigeants de syndicats de prendre ces résolutions sérieusement et de faire les actions là-dessus.
Of not exactly a union organizing, but will be the recent case of the police who got convicted for killing of George Floyd. And that has never happened before. It was like for organizing of Black Lives Matters and many others, constantly on the streets and everywhere, asking for such a change that nobody would really think that might happen, that a cop get convicted for murder of a Black man. And so that shows that how much on-ground activism can push and force the system, and the leadership that might not want to make a change, but they have to.
Thank you, Nilu. Ryan, do you have any groups whose organizing you're keeping an eye on, or anything to add about what we've seen from cops out of CUPE?
Yeah, I just dropped a link in the chat for the campaign Choosing Real Safety. And it speaks to one of the questions I saw, which is, sometimes there's a bit of a pushback just around the word defunding. And I think it's an important opening, and that's an important conversation to have. But it might also be worth checking out this declaration, because it does come from an abolitionist perspective, but they've kind of framed it in a bit more of an inviting way. And they are looking for endorsements. So perhaps if you're part of a union local or participate in your local labor council, you might ask them to endorse this. I think a number of CUPE locals already have. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers has, and so is Unifor. But I think many more unions could step up, and this could be one way to start activating people around this issue. I'm part of a kind of a small group called Labor for Defunding Police. And most of what we've been doing so far has just sort of been sharing analysis, trying to map just the realities of police unionism in Canada. And that's just because of limited capacity. But I think with so much people turning out today, if there's interest, definitely reach out. Would love to connect with anyone who's interested in organizing around these issues. I know a lot of people in their labor councils have been having conversations within their labor councils, supporting local defunding campaigns, which is great. And hopefully we can do more to kind of link up our efforts. I think we already saw, for example, when I was writing the piece for Briarpatch last year in June, the Canadian Labour Congress didn't have a position on defunding. But a few months later, by October, because of, I think, a lot of the groundswell, the bottom-up pressure, they came out and put a statement that's spoken in favor of defunding. And I think that was really good to see. And it'd be great to see more kind of concrete follow-up. For example, with the Ontario Federation of Labour and their partnership with the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists of Ontario, they put out a statement very early, but they've also actually kind of followed up by continuing to push out this messaging, having webinars that are educational. And so it's nice to see that, it's not just a statement, but something that they're trying to enact. And I think they really need to hear from us, people who support this type of work, to let them know that we want to see more of it.
Okay, we're going to take a quick water break for our interpreter to breathe and drink water. And me too. Okay, so we're going to move on to the Q&A portion. So if you have questions, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. Click on it and you should be able to drop your question in there. There are two questions that kind of tackle similar topics that I think are interesting. So I'm going to read them both, and we can answer sort of the spirit of the questions. So Sam Hirsch asks, I work for a union that doesn't have police in it, but definitely has a mixed view on defunding. Some of them say they rely on police for safety. I work for a transit union, and driver assaults is a big issue. How do we work within these types of unions to be able to get locals and national leadership to take a position in support of defunding the police? And the question that I think is similar to this is asked by Maya Duncan, who writes, following up on a previous question, CUPE Ontario's executive position is that not unionizing RCMP surveillance means denying, quote unquote, those poor women protection from sexual harassment. This is obviously BS and frustrating considering how hard we've had to fight them to take sexual violence seriously. But what kind of answer can we give to something like that? It hits all the right notes for woke centrists. So these two questions are both about real and overblown ideas of the extent to which police provide safety for other union members. I'm wondering, Ryan or Nilu, do you have a response to how to talk to union members who feel like the police provide safety to them?
I will start on it. Well, when we say police provide safety, we should ask for whom, because many of the communities do not feel safe when they see police, including myself. And so the question of safety can be tackled in many different ways. Can we create a community force that keep us safe? What kind of forms of specific internal structures can be built to makes us safe, and on and on. And about sexual harassment, well, we know that if a woman or a person with all genders face such a
Okay, have we lost Nilu? Okay. I also just wanted to hop in here. We'll see if Nilu comes back in a second. But I'm realizing after rereading Maya and Sam's questions that they're actually quite different. Maya's question is not about women in the communities that the RCMP surveils, but rather women who work for the surveillance portion of the RCMP, and people basically saying that that if they're not unionized, then they won't have protection from sexual harassment. So it was not right of me to lump those two questions together. But sorry, Nilu, you cut out again, but it looks like you're back.
Yes.
Anyways, two separate questions might demand two separate answers. One is about union members who feel like they rely on cops for protection, and another one is about cops or cop adjacent people who believe that they rely on unions for protection.
Yes, I got cut off, and but to answer Maya's question, my thought is that well, like dismantle RCMP to defund RCMP too, and well, when we say that like unions cannot really support women in sexual assault cases either. Unions pass kind of like, it is also so hard within the unions to pass sexual assault workplace policies, but it is up on, I guess, RCMP rank and file to push for such policy in their workplace. I don't know if Ryan has better answer.
No, I think it's a good point, and it's a very practical question too. Like when we start raising these conversations, people sometimes make different arguments, and maybe some of them will be not fully kind of genuine arguments, but they'll be used to try to derail the conversation. And I think it's on us to try to reframe it. In the case of like the RCMP or the prison guards, and people saying, you know, these workers face oppression on the basis of their gender or their race, that may be true, but their work is also actively harming and in some cases killing people. So the point is to try to get people out of those occupations, to limit and actually eliminate the growth of the carceral state and state violence. And so we shouldn't be making excuses for it. If those workers are in danger, let's get them out of those jobs. And then to the other question, I think is also a good one. A lot of people, I think, yeah, are sort of, we're conditioned to think that the police are an answer for safety. I think that is part of, I think, the educational work we need to do. Having spaces for anti-racism, having spaces for Black, Indigenous, and racialized union members to speak to their experiences and how they're actually contrary to the idea of police providing real safety, and making space to imagine those alternatives. As we've already said, that's actually quite difficult when you have the actual police in your union actively trying to shut down those conversations.
Okay, another question is, are there groups building national solidarity of various unionized workers? Let's get everyone tooled up to chip away at the carceral state. A list. Yeah, there's nothing that I know of, but Ryan or Nilu, what's our best bet here?
I think it's a tough one to answer because unfortunately that doesn't exist to my knowledge, but if someone else knows of it, please do share. In the absence of that, we've been trying to put together some resources, just trying to map all the work that people are doing. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have more to share on that beyond just it's great that there's so many people here today connecting. And I think even when I saw the webinars that some of our labor councils put on, there were over 1,000 people registering for these events. And when's the last time that happened for a union event? Obviously, there's a lot of interest, and we need to help solidify that and organize and yeah, and link up our efforts.
Yes, I agree with Ryan, and I don't have much to add to this, but I recollected my thoughts on the previous question. If I can just add something. The question of RCMP and sexual harassment is kind of like a question of chicken and egg. As RCMP, kind of like, we know that when the cases happens especially in the cases of murder and missing Indigenous women, they do not follow up and they do not take the cases serious unless there be kind of like, for example, in the same areas, if a white tourist get lost, they will get into the bottom of the case within a few weeks, which was the case, I guess, last year or 2 years ago. And then we have the RCMP offices within their forces that who also are facing sexual harassment from the forces. So the answer to solve it is like RCMP is not helpful and also is harmful to the communities and to the women who are working there. Why do we kind of like in any way want to empower those forces? And as Ryan said, let's get those workers who are facing violence out of that kind of like force.
Another question from an anonymous attendee who writes, similar issues when having these conversations with paramedics. Many have expressed fear of retribution at work from police if paramedic unions call publicly for defunding. Nilu or Ryan, do you have ideas about how to address that fear of retribution, or what kind of structures we should be building to keep union members safe from retribution by police if unions start calling to defund the police?
I mean, just first, I just want to acknowledge the obvious, like how sad is it that that is the reality, like that people are on side, but what inhibits them from showing solidarity is the fear of the police, which actually proves our point about why they need to be defunded and why we need real alternatives. I think one thing I could offer is that I've noticed that, for example, people have worked through their labor councils, which of course are like composites of many different unions, to put forward some of these motions. So that might be one way, at least initially, to get conversations started, to get maybe some movement in your city that might allow for people to feel like if they speak out, they won't be alone and they won't be isolated. They're doing it as part of a broader movement. So that might be something to consider based on your local context.
Yeah, the good old slogan of strength in numbers might become helpful if people can create a kind of like network of support and then voice their concerns about police would be very way more powerful. Although paramedics and firefighters with police, and you can see there's more hesitance. But I'm sure that building more support on the ground will be helpful.
There's a question that I'm kind of confused about the phrasing. So I'm going to read it and maybe we can decipher it together, or the person who wrote the question can type a bit of a clarification. But they write, is it possible for public servants to support these ideas without being complicit in them, i.e., occupying other positions in prisons or being part of unions that also protect officers? Very much related to the fear of reprisal as most public servants can be limited in what political positions and how much dissent they can publicly share. So I'm not sure if this is a question about reprisals for folks who already work in public sector unions or are members of public sector unions, or if they're working in positions that are sort of adjacent to police or prison guards. Ryan or Nilu, do you have any insights here?
Yeah, it felt like there are maybe two questions there. And on the kind of question of, yeah, like what can you do as an individual if maybe you if your job limits what you can say publicly? I think part of the answer to that is that's why we have unions. It's a collective voice for workers, and our unions should be amplifying our voices and demands around defunding the police. And we should be putting pressure on our unions to be advocates around these issues. And that should be a safe space, or at least a space where you can, like Neely was saying, kind of find like-minded people to push this conversation. I'm not sure if I understand the first half, but if it was saying like, you know, can you distance yourself from the worst aspects of, you know, the prison or police system? And I think unfortunately not, right? Because all of those pieces are interlocked. And we were even saying, as members of the labor movement, we are also complicit in these systems of policing, even though we're not employed by the police. But if we're utilizing them, if we're inviting them into our house of labor, there's a degree of complicity there. And I think part of this conversation is saying we need to kind of confront that head on. Not that it'll be easy, but that is part of the ethical and moral kind of obligation that we have. People are being killed by the police. Canada is founded as a settler colonial state that's actively trying to extinguish Indigenous people. And this is an ongoing process. And as much as we all have, you know, these concerns around reprisal, there's also these massive concerns around massive violence. And I think that's why, you know, this work is so crucial.
There's also one question. We sort of addressed this early on, but I read something since then that I thought I might share with folks. So the question is, how will excluding police unions / representatives from unions reduce their power? And I was reading the SEIU Drop the Cops petition on Action Network. And one of their demands is SEIU drop cop candidates. They write, "We demand SEIU drop cop candidates. We demand SEIU provide no support to any political candidate who accepts donations from law enforcement officers, jail and prison guards, probation officers, and armed security officers locals, or who intends to act against defunding the police or the platform of the Movement for Black Lives while in office." So I think something that we also need to talk about when we're talking about the labor movement is that the labor movement is often lobbying other politicians and trying to present a united front around demands. And so if there are cops within the labor movement, those cops can articulate their demands through the labor movement. Whereas if we remove them and they have to form their own police associations and they're no longer part of the labor movement, they can no longer use the apparatus of the labor movement, the power of the labor movement, to further their agendas. And they also don't have access to the resources of the labor movement, and they wouldn't be also benefiting from, say, when a union or a federation decides to back a particular political candidate. And it would mean also that unions and federations would be much less likely to throw their weight behind a cop who is running for political office, something like that. Ryan or Nilu, do you have any additions to that sort of question that is central to this whole webinar? How will excluding police unions and representatives from unions reduce their power?
I don't have much to add, but I think most of what we talked about is kind of like answering this question in some way or other. But we need to, again, reiterate that we need to think about excluding cops from union side by side by defunding the police and refunding the funds into our communities.
Thanks, Nilu. So we haven't been able to get to 100% of the questions tonight, but we've gotten a lot of people mentioning that it would be great if we could gather folks in attendance tonight and organize collectively across union sectors, jurisdictions. One of the big problems when it comes to folks within the labor movement talking about defunding the police, as I've said multiple times tonight, is the hesitancy around it, the fear about losing your job or facing reprisals. So we were planning on trying to put together some resources for participants in this webinar. Things have been very busy. There is a public health crisis. We didn't really get around to it. One thing we wanted to provide was a template for a resolution that people could introduce at their local, something like that, or at their local convention. Also, where police exist within unions. But if we do, I've seen people being like, oh my God, that was my homework. I was supposed to make that. It's okay. If we do make those resources and we want to send them out, we'll send them out to attendees after this panel concludes. And we might have, for example, a sign-up form if people express a desire to keep organizing around this and be connected to each other around this issue. So other than that, I'm just looking at my wrap-up stuff. So that was sort of our off-ramp items are still TBA. You'll keep an eye on your emails for resources from us and ideas on ways to continue this work. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to everyone's question today, but I just wanted to say a big thank you to our two speakers who came and spoke today so eloquently about this issue and were willing to speak when it can be a scary thing to talk about, to be honest. I wanted to say a big thank you to all of the team that are the legs of the duck underwater paddling furiously while we all looked calm up here. There were a lot of people who helped make this webinar possible, weeks and months of work that went into creating this. So thank you to all of them for their hard work tonight and in the weeks prior to this. Thank you to Noelle for tirelessly interpreting and reminding us to speak slower. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight for your curiosity about this topic, your commitment to justice and to real safety for us all, and for wanting to keep these conversations going in your communities and in your unions after tonight. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.